History is supposed to make sense. One thing leads to another. Civilizations rise, flourish, and eventually decline, but they leave traces. They leave records, artifacts, stories passed down through generations. We're supposed to be able to follow the thread from ancient times to the present day, understanding how we got here, how humanity evolved from scattered tribes to global civilization. Except that's not what happened. If you look closely at the historical record, really examine the evidence we have, you'll find something deeply unsettling. There are gaps, not small gaps, not minor inconsistencies, but enormous holes in our understanding of human history. Entire civilizations that seem to appear out of nowhere, fully formed with no obvious predecessors. Periods where advanced societies simply vanish, leaving behind ruins that their descendants couldn't explain. Technologies that emerge without any apparent development period, as if someone just invented them overnight. These aren't just missing footnotes in history books. These are entire chapters that seem to have been torn out, epochs where millions of people lived and died and built and created, and we have almost no idea what they were doing or how they did it. Where did they come from? Where did they go? What did they know that we've forgotten? The Bronze Age kingdoms of the Mediterranean didn't gradually fade away. They collapsed in a single generation, and we still can't fully explain why. Ancient Egypt appears on the historical stage as a fully formed civilization with no clear developmental period. The Indus Valley civilization built cities more sophisticated than anything in Europe at the time, then vanished so completely we can't even read their writing. Entire cultures in the Americas rose to heights we're only beginning to understand, then disappeared before anyone wrote down their stories. These are the lost epochs, the dark spaces in our timeline where the evidence runs out and we're left with more questions than answers. Now, if you're using this video to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I always read the comments, and it's fascinating seeing Tokyo at sunrise and Toronto at midnight, all of us wondering about the same mysteries together. Here's what makes these gaps so compelling. It's not that we have no evidence. We have ruins, artifacts, sometimes even written texts, but the context is missing. It's like finding a sophisticated machine with no instruction manual, no patent filing, no record of who built it or why. You can see that it exists, that it once functioned, but you can't understand how it came to be. Take the problem of sudden complexity. Civilizations aren't supposed to just appear. They're supposed to develop gradually, step by step. You start with simple farming villages. Over centuries, some villages grow into towns. Eventually, towns become cities. Along the way, you invent writing to keep track of trade. You develop specialized crafts. You create administrative systems. Each step builds on the previous one, but that's not always what the archaeological record shows. Sometimes we find sophisticated urban civilizations with no obvious precursors. It's like the first draft was the final draft. No rough sketches, no practice runs, just sudden, inexplicable sophistication. Or consider the disappearances. Civilizations don't usually just vanish. Even when empires fall, something remains. Successor states, cultural continuity, people who remember the old ways. Rome fell, but Latin survived. The language evolved into French, Spanish, and Italian. Roman law influenced European legal systems for centuries. The Catholic Church preserved Roman administrative structures. When Rome ended, it didn't disappear. it transformed. But some civilizations didn't transform, they just stopped. No successor states, no cultural continuity, no one left who could explain what had happened, just ruins and silence. And then there's the problem of lost knowledge. We find artifacts that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, engineering, but we have no record of how that knowledge was developed or transmitted. No textbooks, no training manuals, no accounts of the master craftsmen who passed their skills to apprentices. Just the finished products sitting in museums, mute testimony to capabilities we can observe but not explain. These gaps aren't just academic puzzles. They're reminders of something unsettling. Civilization is more fragile than we like to think. Knowledge can be lost. Entire ways of life can disappear. The things we assume are permanent, writing, cities, organized government, these can all vanish within a few generations if the systems supporting them collapse. Tonight, we're going to explore these lost epochs. We'll start with the problem of sudden sophistication, looking at civilizations that appear to emerge fully formed with no clear developmental period. We'll examine the mysterious collapses, societies that vanished so completely their own descendants couldn't explain what happened to them. We'll investigate lost technologies, capabilities that ancient peoples possessed but couldn't or didn't pass down to future generations. We'll trace the gaps in the written record, periods where documentation simply stops existing. We'll explore sunken coastlines where entire populations once lived before rising seas erased their settlements. And we'll end with the question that haunts all of this. What else are we missing? What other epochs have been lost so completely that we don't even know to look for them? There's something deeply calming about these mysteries. Unlike breaking news or current events, these puzzles have been waiting for thousands of years. They'll still be here tomorrow, next week, next century. There's no urgency, no deadline, just the quiet comfort of knowing that history is far stranger and more incomplete than we usually acknowledge. So get comfortable. Let your mind wander through these gaps in time. And let's explore together the lost epochs, the missing chapters in humanity's story, where entire civilizations wait in the darkness, hoping someone will remember they were here. Let's start with a question that should bother anyone who thinks about ancient history. How does a civilization just appear? We're taught that development is gradual. You start with simple technologies and slowly build complexity over generations. Hunter-gatherers domesticate plants, which leads to agriculture. Agriculture creates surplus food, which allows specialization. Specialization leads to crafts, trade, cities. Cities require administration, which leads to writing. It's supposed to be a slow process, each step requiring centuries to fully develop before the next step becomes possible. This is the standard model of civilization development, and it works for some cases. We can trace the development of Mesopotamian civilization fairly clearly. Small villages appear around 6000 BCE. Over the next few millennia, they grow into towns, then cities. Writing emerges gradually, starting as simple counting marks and evolving into full cuneiform script. We can follow the progression, but other civilizations don't follow this pattern. Consider Corral in Peru. It's one of the oldest cities in the Americas, dating to around 3000 BCE, making it contemporaneous with the pyramids of Egypt and older than anything in Mesoamerica by more than 1,000 years. But here's what's strange about Corral. It appears suddenly in the archaeological record. One period we have small fishing villages along the Peruvian coast. The next period we have a city covering 150 acres with massive platform mounds, sunken circular plazas, and evidence of a population of several thousand people. The main pyramid at Corral, the Pyramide Mare, is 60 feet tall and covers an area of 4 acres. It wasn't built in a single construction phase, it was built in multiple stages, with later construction phases adding to and modifying earlier structures. This indicates long-term planning and sustained organizational capacity. The site shows evidence of sophisticated engineering. The platforms are built with stone and mortar. The plazas are precisely aligned. There are complex networks of channels, possibly for water management or acoustic purposes. The whole city is laid out according to an organized plan, not the random organic growth you'd expect from an early settlement. But where did this capability come from? We have no evidence of earlier experimental phases, no primitive versions of the pyramids, no smaller practice plazas where they figured out the techniques. It's like the people of Corral went from fishing villages to monumental architecture in a single leap. Now, archaeologists will tell you this isn't quite accurate. They'll point out that we probably just haven't found the earlier developmental sites yet, that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, that future excavations will fill in the gaps. And they're probably right, but that's the point. The gaps exist. We can see the end point, this sophisticated urban civilization, but the path that led there remains unclear. This pattern repeats across the ancient world. The Norte Chico civilization, which Corral was part of, flourished along the Peruvian coast for over 1,000 years. During that time, they built at least 30 major centers with monumental architecture. But they had no pottery, which is strange because pottery is usually one of the first technologies sedentary societies develop. They had no ceramics at all until very late in their history. They also appear to have had no warfare, no fortifications, no weapons, no art depicting combat or warriors. This is almost unique among early civilizations. Cities usually develop defensive walls and military capabilities early on. So how did they organize large construction projects without military coercion? How did they maintain social cohesion across multiple centers without a warrior class? How did they mobilize labor for building pyramids? We don't know. And because they had no writing, they left no explanations. The Norte Chico disappeared around 1800 BCE, not in a sudden catastrophic collapse, but in a gradual decline as the population moved to other areas. And when they left, whatever organizational systems they developed, whatever knowledge they'd accumulated, it wasn't fully passed on to their successors. Later, Andean civilizations like the Moche and Inca built their own impressive monuments, but the specific techniques and social structures of Norte Chico were lost. Or take Poverty Point in Louisiana. Around 1700 BCE, someone built an enormous earthwork complex in the Mississippi River Valley. The site covers 400 acres and includes massive concentric ridges arranged in a C shape opening toward the river. The outer ridge is 3/4 of a mile across. The ridges themselves are 4 to 6 feet high and up to 80 feet wide at the base. This wasn't natural terrain, this was deliberate construction requiring moving hundreds of thousands of tons of earth, one basket load at a time. The labor investment was enormous. And it's not just earthworks. Poverty Point was a major trade center. Artifacts found at the site include copper from the Great Lakes, galena from Missouri, soapstone from Alabama, flint from Ohio. These materials traveled hundreds of miles through trade networks that must have been sophisticated and well established, but we have no idea who these people were. They had no writing. They left no clear descendants. The culture seems to have flourished for a few centuries, then disappeared. Later, indigenous groups in the area had no memory of who built Poverty Point. The site sat abandoned for over 3,000 years before archaeologists recognized it as an artificial construction. Local people knew it was there, obviously. It's hard to miss earthworks that size, but nobody knew what it was or who built it. These aren't isolated cases. Around the world, we find evidence of sudden sophistication, capabilities that appear without obvious precursors. The megalithic structures of Malta, built between 3,600 and 2,500 BCE, include some of the oldest freestanding stone buildings in the world, predating Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids. These weren't simple stone circles. They were complex temple structures with sophisticated architectural features. Corbelled ceilings, decorated walls, precise alignments to celestial events. But Malta is a small island with limited resources. Where did the population come from to build these structures? Where did they learn the stoneworking techniques? The archaeological evidence shows a relatively simple Neolithic culture. Then suddenly these magnificent temples, then a period of decline where the temples were abandoned, or consider the Olmec in Mesoamerica. They're often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, and for good reason. They developed the first major civilization in Mexico, flourishing from around 1500 to 400 BCE. They created the first writing system in the Americas, the first calendar, the first major ceremonial centers, and they carved massive stone heads, some weighing up to 50 tons. These heads show sophisticated understanding of stone carving, of mass, balance, three-dimensional representation. They're not primitive first attempts. They're accomplished works of art. But the Olmec appear in the archaeological record suddenly. One period, there's a relatively simple village culture. The next period, there are major centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta, with monumental stone sculptures, elaborate earthwork platforms, and evidence of long-distance trade networks. Where did the capability come from? How did they develop the techniques for moving 50-ton stones without wheels or draft animals? How did they learn to carve such precise, naturalistic sculptures? We don't know. The Olmec left no written records explaining their origins or their techniques. Later, Mesoamerican cultures, like the Maya, inherited many Olmec innovations, but the specific knowledge of how those innovations developed was lost. This is what makes the gaps so frustrating. We can see that something remarkable happened. We can see the results, but we can't see the process. It's like watching a magic trick. You see the magician's hands moving, you see the rabbit appear, but you miss the crucial moment where the trick actually happens. Now, there are explanations for all of this. Archaeologists aren't baffled in the sense of having no theories. They have plenty of theories. Maybe the developmental phases happened in places we haven't excavated yet. Maybe they used perishable materials like wood that haven't survived in the archaeological record. Maybe the population was more sophisticated than their material culture suggests, and they made conceptual leaps that seem impossible to us but were obvious to them. All of these explanations are probably partly true, but they all amount to saying we don't know, we can't see the process, the evidence is missing. And sometimes the gaps are even stranger because we can see both sides. We can see the before and the after. We just can't see the transition. Take the invention of farming. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans were hunter-gatherers. We followed animal herds. We foraged for plants. We moved seasonally to exploit different resources. This worked. It kept our ancestors alive for tens of thousands of generations. Then, around 10,000 years ago, multiple groups around the world independently invented agriculture. In the Fertile Crescent, people domesticated wheat and barley. In China, they domesticated rice and millet. In Mesoamerica, they domesticated corn, beans, and squash. In Africa, they domesticated sorghum and yams. In South America, they domesticated potatoes and quinoa. This happened independently in multiple places within a relatively short time span. Within a few thousand years, the majority of the human population had transitioned from hunting and gathering to farming. Why? What changed that made multiple groups, separated by thousands of miles, all decide within the same few millennia that farming was better than foraging? The standard answer is that the climate stabilized after the end of the Ice Age, making agriculture more viable. And that's probably part of it. But humans had experienced climate stabilization before. There were warm periods during the Ice Age. Why didn't agriculture develop then? Some researchers think population pressure was the key factor. As human populations grew, hunting and gathering couldn't support the same number of people per square mile that agriculture could. But why did populations suddenly grow enough to create pressure? What changed? Others think it was an accident. Someone noticed that seeds they dropped near their camp grew into plants. They started deliberately planting seeds. It became a habit, then a practice, then a way of life. But if it was that easy, why didn't it happen earlier? The truth is, we don't really understand why agriculture was invented when it was. We can see hunter-gatherer societies before. We can see agricultural societies after. But the transition itself, the moment when humans stopped following food and started producing it, that's obscured. And this matters because agriculture changed everything. It's not an exaggeration to say that agriculture made civilization possible. Without it, you can't support dense populations. Without dense populations, you can't have specialization. Without specialization, you can't develop complex technologies. Everything we think of as civilization flows from that transition to agriculture. But we missed it. It happened in the gap, in that period where the evidence is too sparse, too scattered, too ambiguous to give us a clear picture. This is the pattern we see again and again throughout human history. Crucial transitions happening just outside our view, capabilities appearing without clear precursors, knowledge emerging from somewhere, we're not sure where. It's like walking through a museum where every other room is closed for renovation. You can see the exhibits that are available. You can make guesses about what's in the closed rooms, but you can't actually look inside. You can't verify your assumptions. And sometimes, just sometimes, you find a door that's been forgotten entirely. A room that's been sealed for so long that nobody remembers it exists. That's when things get really interesting. Because if there are lost epochs we know about, gaps in the record we can identify, how many more gaps might there be that we haven't even recognized yet? How much of human history is missing without us realizing it's gone? Now let's talk about something even more disturbing than sudden sophistication. Let's talk about civilizations that didn't just decline, they vanished. When we think about fallen civilizations, we usually imagine a gradual process. The empire gets too large to manage efficiently, corruption weakens the government, barbarians pressure the borders. Economic problems create instability. Over generations or centuries, the civilization transforms into something else. The old structures crumble, but new ones take their place. That's the model. That's how it's supposed to work. But sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes civilizations just stop. Not gradually, not with a clear successor, they just end, and when they end, they take their knowledge with them. The Minoans on Crete are a perfect example. For nearly 1,000 years, Minoan civilization dominated the eastern Mediterranean. They built elaborate palaces with indoor plumbing, sophisticated frescoes, and complex storage systems. They developed their own writing systems, Linear A, which we still can't decipher. They created a trading network that stretched from Egypt to the Greek mainland to Anatolia. The palace at Knossos, their main center, was enormous, a complex structure covering 6 acres with hundreds of rooms. It had running water, flush toilets, light wells to illuminate interior spaces, and a ventilation system that provided air circulation. This is 1700 BCE. The Minoans were living in palatial comfort that wouldn't be matched in Europe for over 2,000 years. And then, around 1450 BCE, it all ended. The palaces were destroyed, most were never rebuilt. Minoan culture effectively disappeared. Within a generation or two, a civilization that had flourished for a millennium was gone. What happened? The theories are numerous. Maybe it was a volcanic eruption. The island of Thera, about 70 miles north of Crete, exploded in one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history, around 1600 BCE. The eruption destroyed Thera completely, buried it under hundreds of feet of ash and pumice. It probably caused massive tsunamis that would have devastated the northern coast of Crete. But here's the problem. The Thera eruption happened around 1600 BCE. The Minoan palaces weren't destroyed until 1450 BCE. That's a 150-year gap. The Minoans survived the eruption and its immediate aftermath. They rebuilt, they continued trading, so the volcano alone can't explain the final collapse. Maybe it was invasion. The Mycenaeans from mainland Greece were expanding their power around this time. Maybe they conquered Crete. But if they did, why destroy the palaces? Why not occupy them? The Mycenaeans certainly appreciated Minoan culture. They copied Minoan art styles, adopted Minoan religious symbols, even adapted the Minoan Linear A script to create their own Linear B. Or maybe it was internal collapse. Maybe the palaces got too powerful, demanded too much from the population, created resentment that exploded into revolt. But then why do we see destruction across multiple palaces simultaneously? Internal revolts are usually more localized. The truth is, we don't know. And the reason we don't know is because the Minoans left no explanation. Linear A remains undeciphered. We can't read their records. We can't hear their side of the story. All we have is the destruction layers and silence. And with the Minoans went their knowledge. How did they build their palaces? What engineering principles did they use for their plumbing systems? How did they navigate such extensive trade networks without compasses? How did their economy function? What were their religious beliefs? What stories did they tell their children? We have hints from the art, bull-leaping scenes that might indicate religious rituals, snake goddesses that might represent a mother goddess cult, frescoes showing what might be religious processions or diplomatic ceremonies. But these are ambiguous. We're interpreting symbols without knowing what they meant to the people who created them. The Minoans are just one example. This pattern, sophisticated civilization followed by sudden disappearance, repeats throughout history. Take the Aksumite Empire in East Africa. From around 100 to 940 CE, Aksum was one of the great powers of the ancient world. They controlled trade routes connecting Africa with Arabia and India. They minted their own coins, which circulated from India to the Mediterranean. They built massive stone obelisks, some over 100 feet tall and weighing hundreds of tons. They developed their own writing system, Ge'ez, which is still used in Ethiopia today for religious texts. Aksum was wealthy, powerful, sophisticated. In the 4th century CE, they became one of the first Christian kingdoms, and their rulers considered themselves equals to the emperors of Rome and Persia. And then, gradually, it faded. By 940 CE, Aksum was no longer a major power. The capital was eventually abandoned. The trade networks collapsed. The kingdom fragmented. Why? Climate change is one theory. The climate in the region became drier, making agriculture more difficult. Environmental degradation from deforestation might have exacerbated the problem. As resources became scarce, the centralized state couldn't maintain itself. Islamic expansion is another theory. As Muslim powers controlled more of the Red Sea trade routes, Aksum lost access to the maritime commerce that had made it wealthy. Cut off from trade, the empire's economic base collapsed. But again, these are theories. The historical record from this period is thin. Aksum left inscriptions and monuments, but not detailed chronicles explaining what was happening or why. The transition from major power to regional kingdom happened in the gap, the period where documentation is sparse and ambiguous, and with Aksum's decline went knowledge. The techniques for quarrying and erecting those massive obelisks were lost. Later, Ethiopian kingdoms didn't build monuments on that scale. The international connections, the diplomatic relationships, the trade networks, all gone. The continuity was broken. Or consider the ancestral Puebloans, the people who built Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. These weren't simple cliff dwellings. Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon was the largest building in North America until the 1880s. It had over 600 rooms, rose 4 stories high in places, and was part of a network of roads connecting dozens of outlying sites. The Chacoans were sophisticated astronomers. They aligned buildings to solar and lunar events with precision that required generations of careful observation. They managed water in a desert environment through an elaborate system of dams and canals. They imported materials from hundreds of miles away. Turquoise from New Mexico, macaws from Mexico, shells from the Pacific coast. And then, around 1150 CE, they left. The great houses at Chaco Canyon were abandoned. The road system fell into disuse. The population dispersed. Why? Drought is the usual answer. Tree ring data shows a severe drought in the region around this time, but the ancestral Puebloans had dealt with droughts before. They'd been living in this environment for centuries. They knew how to manage water scarcity. So why did this particular drought cause abandonment? Maybe it was combined stresses. Drought plus environmental degradation plus social conflict plus pressure from neighboring groups. Maybe it was a systems collapse where multiple problems reinforced each other until the society couldn't cope. But we don't know. The ancestral Puebloans had no writing, they left no explanation. Modern Pueblo peoples are clearly descended from them and maintain cultural continuity in many ways. But the specific reasons for the abandonment of Chaco, the details of what happened, those were lost. And this is what makes these disappearances so unsettling. These weren't primitive societies that collapsed because they lacked the knowledge to survive. These were sophisticated cultures with centuries of accumulated wisdom about their environments. They knew how to build, how to farm, how to organize large populations. They weren't ignorant, but they still failed, or rather, they changed so dramatically that continuity was broken, and in that break, knowledge was lost. This happens more often than we'd like to admit. The classic Maya civilization, which flourished from about 250 to 900 CE, is another example. The Maya built magnificent cities with pyramids, palaces, and ball courts. They developed the most sophisticated writing system in pre-Columbian Americas. They made astronomical observations of incredible precision. They created a complex calendar system that tracked cycles spanning thousands of years. And then, starting around 800 CE, the cities in the southern lowlands were abandoned. Not all at once, but over a century or two, the major centers were deserted. The population plummeted. Monumental construction stopped. The sophisticated classic Maya culture effectively ended. The Maya people didn't disappear. Their descendants still live in the region today, maintaining many cultural traditions. But the classic period civilization, the one that built the pyramids and kept the astronomical records, that ended. And with it went specific knowledge that wasn't fully passed on. We can't read most Maya texts. We've deciphered the script to the point where we can read royal histories and religious texts, but huge portions remain unclear. And most Maya texts didn't survive anyway. The Spanish conquistadors and missionaries burned thousands of Maya books, considering them pagan and demonic. Only 4 Maya codices survive from before the Spanish conquest. How much knowledge was lost in those fires? How much understanding of Maya science, mathematics, astronomy, history went up in smoke? We'll never know. That's the point. The gap exists not because the Maya didn't record things, but because their records were deliberately destroyed. And that's perhaps the most tragic form of lost epoch. Not the accidental loss to time and decay, but the intentional erasure. This brings us to a disturbing realization. The gaps in our historical knowledge aren't all natural. Some of them are artificial, created by conquest, suppression, the desire of later cultures to erase earlier ones. Think about what happened to indigenous American cultures after European contact. The civilizations that existed in 1491 were complex, sophisticated, and diverse. The Inca Empire was the largest empire in pre-Columbian Americas, stretching from modern Ecuador to Chile, with a population of perhaps 12 million people. The Aztec Empire controlled most of central Mexico. The Maya city-states still flourished in Yucatan. Countless other cultures thrived throughout North and South America. Within 150 years, most of this was gone. Not just the empires, but the cultures themselves. The knowledge systems, the ways of life, the accumulated wisdom of generations. Disease killed the majority. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, epidemics swept through populations that had no immunity. Some estimates suggest 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died within a century of European contact. But the destruction wasn't just biological, it was cultural. Spanish missionaries deliberately destroyed indigenous books and records. They suppressed native religions. They forced conversion to Christianity. They replaced indigenous languages with Spanish. They reordered society according to European models. The English and other colonizers weren't much better. They displaced populations, broke up communities, separated children from parents to erase cultural transmission. They declared indigenous religions primitive and banned their practice. They took children to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their native languages. The result is that vast stretches of pre-Columbian American history are irretrievable. The oral traditions that could have preserved the knowledge died with the elders. The books that could have explained their civilizations were burned. The cultural continuity that could have maintained the traditions was deliberately broken. This isn't ancient history. This erasure continued into the 20th century in many places. The last indigenous boarding schools in the United States didn't close until the 1970s, and the loss is staggering. We're missing centuries of history, entire civilizations whose stories will never be fully known, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because it was destroyed. The gap was created deliberately, an act of cultural genocide that eliminated entire epochs of human experience. But even without deliberate destruction, knowledge can be lost frighteningly quickly. Consider what happened in Europe after the fall of Rome. The Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE. Within a few generations, capabilities that had been common for centuries became rare or forgotten. The ability to build in stone, the knowledge of concrete and how to make it, the engineering skills to construct aqueducts and bridges, the administrative systems to maintain roads, the literacy necessary to keep records and transmit knowledge. All of this declined precipitously. It's not that the knowledge was deliberately suppressed, it's that the systems supporting it collapsed. When cities depended on trade for food and the trade routes became unsafe, the cities shrank. When fewer people lived in cities, there were fewer jobs requiring literacy. When literacy declined, fewer people could read the technical manuals explaining how Roman engineering worked. When the manuals couldn't be read, the knowledge in them was lost. Within 200 years, Western Europe had lost capabilities it had possessed for centuries. Within 400 years, people were living in the ruins of Roman buildings they couldn't replicate and didn't fully understand. This is the terrifying thing about civilizational collapse. It's not that everything vanishes overnight, it's that knowledge evaporates. The specialists who know how to do complex things, they die without passing on their expertise. The books that contain instructions, they decay without being copied. The social structures that support learning, they break down without being replaced. And once the knowledge is lost, it can take centuries to rediscover. Europeans didn't figure out how to make Roman concrete again until the modern era. The engineering principles that allowed Roman aqueducts to function weren't fully understood until the 18th century. We're still not entirely sure how some Roman buildings were constructed. This is why the gaps matter. They're not just intellectual puzzles, they're warnings. They show us how fragile our accumulated knowledge really is, how quickly it can be lost if the systems supporting it fail, how easily entire epochs can slip through our fingers, leaving only ruins and questions. And sometimes the gaps are created by something even simpler: lack of interest. Nobody thought the information was worth preserving, so it wasn't. How many indigenous languages have gone extinct without being recorded? How many oral traditions have been lost because nobody wrote them down before the last speaker died? How many cultural practices have vanished because nobody thought they were important enough to document? The gaps aren't always dramatic. Sometimes they're just quiet erasures, the steady loss of knowledge through simple neglect, but the result is the same: missing epochs, lost chapters, entire ways of being human that we can no longer access. And the question we have to ask is, what are we losing right now without realizing it? What knowledge, what practices, what ways of understanding the world are vanishing even as we speak because we're not paying attention, because we don't think they matter, because we assume they'll always be there? The lost epochs aren't just in the past, they're being created right now, and future generations will look back at our time and wonder what we knew that they've forgotten, what we could do that they've lost the ability to replicate, what we understood that has slipped through the cracks of history. The gaps are always growing. The question is whether we can do anything to slow them down. Now let's talk about something that should make every archaeologist uneasy: the problem of lost technologies. We tend to think of technological progress as linear and permanent. Once something is invented, it stays invented. Once we learn how to do something, that knowledge persists. We build on what came before, each generation standing on the shoulders of the previous one, seeing further, understanding more. But that's not how it actually works. Technology isn't automatically preserved. It exists in people's minds, in their skills, in their accumulated experience. And if those people die without passing on their knowledge, if the social structures supporting the technology collapse, if the demand for that technology disappears, it can vanish. And it has, repeatedly. Throughout history, we've lost technologies that took centuries to develop, only to have to reinvent them later, sometimes much later. The ancient Greeks built remarkable automated devices. Hero of Alexandria, working in the 1st century CE, created designs for automatic doors that opened when a fire was lit on an altar, using the expansion of heated air to create hydraulic pressure. He designed vending machines that dispensed holy water when you inserted a coin. He built a steam engine, the Aeolipile, that used steam pressure to create rotary motion. These weren't theoretical designs. They were built. They worked. We have descriptions of them in Hero's writings, but the Greeks never developed these technologies further. The Aeolipile remained a curiosity, a clever device for temples and demonstrations, never applied to practical industry. When the Roman Empire fell and the knowledge of classical science declined in Europe, the designs were forgotten. It would be over 1,500 years before Europeans reinvented the steam engine. Why didn't the Greeks develop it? They had all the necessary knowledge. They understood the principles. They built working prototypes. What was missing? Probably economic incentive. Slave labor was cheap and abundant. There was no pressing need for labor-saving devices. The social structure of ancient society didn't create pressure for industrialization, but that means that technology isn't inevitable, it's contingent. Just because something can be invented doesn't mean it will be. Just because it is invented doesn't mean it will be developed. Just because it's developed doesn't mean it will persist. The recipe for Greek fire is lost. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had a devastating weapon, a liquid that burned on water, that couldn't be extinguished with water, that stuck to whatever it touched and burned until there was nothing left to consume. Greek fire was used in naval warfare with spectacular effect, sprayed from tubes mounted on ships to set enemy fleets ablaze. It was one of the Byzantine Empire's most closely guarded secrets. The formula was known to only a few people and passed down carefully to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. It worked. Enemies never figured out the secret, but neither did anyone else, because eventually the few people who knew the formula died without passing it on, or the knowledge was lost in the chaos of Byzantine decline, or the materials became unavailable, or something else happened. We don't know what. What we do know is that by the time the Byzantine Empire fell in 1453, nobody remembered how to make Greek fire. The formula was lost, and despite centuries of attempts by historians and chemists, we still don't know exactly what it was. We have theories. It probably included petroleum distillates, possibly naphtha. It might have included sulfur, quicklime, pine resin, saltpeter, but we don't know the exact proportions, the preparation process, the specific ingredients. The knowledge vanished with the empire. This is the terrifying thing about specialized knowledge. If it exists in only a few people, those people become irreplaceable. And if they fail to pass it on, if the chain of transmission breaks for any reason, that knowledge is gone. Not just forgotten, but potentially unrecoverable. Consider Roman concrete. The Romans built structures that are still standing 2,000 years later. The Pantheon in Rome, completed in 128 CE, has the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. It's been standing for nearly 2,000 years with minimal maintenance. The Colosseum, built in the 1st century CE, still stands despite earthquakes and stone robbers who dismantled parts of it for building materials. Roman concrete was remarkable. It was hydraulic, meaning it could set underwater. It was durable, lasting for millennia. It was strong, capable of supporting massive structures. And it was versatile, able to be formed into complex shapes that wouldn't have been possible with stone blocks. And then the knowledge of how to make it was lost. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the economic and administrative systems supporting large-scale construction projects disappeared. The lime kilns that produced the ingredients for concrete stopped operating. The trained engineers who knew the proper proportions died without fully documenting their techniques. The demand for permanent monumental structures declined. For over 1,000 years, Europeans couldn't replicate Roman concrete. They built in stone, in brick, in other materials. But the specific formula and techniques for making concrete like the Romans had was lost. Modern concrete is different from Roman concrete. It's stronger in some ways, but less durable in others. Roman concrete actually gets stronger over time as seawater reacts with the volcanic ash in the mixture, creating interlocking crystals. Modern concrete deteriorates, especially in marine environments. We've only figured out in the last few decades exactly why Roman concrete was so durable. And even now, we don't replicate it exactly because the materials they used, volcanic ash from specific regions, aren't economically viable for modern construction. This is a technology that was lost for over a millennium, not because it was inferior, but because the civilization that developed it collapsed and the knowledge transmission failed. The same thing happened with Damascus steel. For centuries, bladesmiths in the Middle East produced swords of extraordinary quality. Damascus steel had a distinctive wavy pattern and was renowned for its strength, sharpness, and flexibility. The blades could supposedly cut through other swords, split a hair falling over the blade, yet flex without breaking. The technique for making true Damascus steel was a closely guarded secret, passed from master to apprentice in a continuous chain. But sometime in the 18th century, the knowledge was lost. Various theories exist. The ore sources were depleted, trade routes were disrupted, the last masters died without apprentices. Whatever the reason, nobody knows how to make authentic Damascus steel anymore. Modern bladesmiths have created pattern-welded steel that looks similar, but metallurgical analysis shows it's not the same. The internal structure is different. Whatever specific technique the original Damascus smiths used, it's gone. This pattern repeats throughout history. Specialized knowledge concentrated in a small number of people, transmitted through informal apprenticeship rather than written documentation, vulnerable to disruption. The Antikythera mechanism is one of the most mysterious artifacts ever discovered. It was found in 1901 in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera. When researchers finally figured out what it was, they were astonished. It's an ancient Greek astronomical calculator built sometime between 150 and 100 BCE. It's incredibly complex, with at least 30 bronze gears that can track the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, predict eclipses, and even model the irregular orbit of the moon. This isn't simple technology, this is sophisticated mechanical engineering. The gearwork is precise. The astronomical knowledge encoded in it is advanced. Whoever built this understood gear ratios, understood how to minimize mechanical error, understood astronomy well enough to model celestial mechanics in bronze. But we have nothing else like it from ancient Greece. No other examples of such sophisticated geared mechanisms, no descriptions in ancient texts of how to build such devices. The Antikythera mechanism stands alone, a singular example of a technology that apparently existed but left no other trace. We have theories. It probably included petroleum distillates, possibly naphtha. It might have included sulfur, quicklime, pine resin, saltpeter, but we don't know the exact proportions, the preparation process, the specific ingredients. The knowledge vanished with the empire. This is the terrifying thing about specialized knowledge. If it exists in only a few people, those people become irreplaceable. And if they fail to pass it on, if the chain of transmission breaks for any reason, that knowledge is gone. Not just forgotten, but potentially unrecoverable. Consider Roman concrete. The Romans built structures that are still standing 2,000 years later. The Pantheon in Rome, completed in 128 CE, has the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. It's been standing for nearly 2,000 years with minimal maintenance. The Colosseum, built in the 1st century CE, still stands despite earthquakes and stone robbers who dismantled parts of it for building materials. Roman concrete was remarkable. It was hydraulic, meaning it could set underwater. It was durable, lasting for millennia. It was strong, capable of supporting massive structures. And it was versatile, able to be formed into complex shapes that wouldn't have been possible with stone blocks. And then the knowledge of how to make it was lost. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the economic and administrative systems supporting large-scale construction projects disappeared. The lime kilns that produced the ingredients for concrete stopped operating. The trained engineers who knew the proper proportions died without fully documenting their techniques. The demand for permanent monumental structures declined. For over 1,000 years, Europeans couldn't replicate Roman concrete. They built in stone, in brick, in other materials. But the specific formula and techniques for making concrete like the Romans had was lost. Modern concrete is different from Roman concrete. It's stronger in some ways but less durable in others. Roman concrete actually gets stronger over time as seawater reacts with the volcanic ash in the mixture, creating interlocking crystals. Modern concrete deteriorates, especially in marine environments. We've only figured out in the last few decades exactly why Roman concrete was so durable. And even now, we don't replicate it exactly because the materials they used, volcanic ash from specific regions, aren't economically viable for modern construction. This is a technology that was lost for over a millennium, not because it was inferior, but because the civilization that developed it collapsed and the knowledge transmission failed. The same thing happened with Damascus steel. For centuries, bladesmiths in the Middle East produced swords of extraordinary quality. Damascus steel had a distinctive wavy pattern and was renowned for its strength, sharpness, and flexibility. The blades could supposedly cut through other swords, split a hair falling over the blade, yet flex without breaking. The technique for making true Damascus steel was a closely guarded secret, passed from master to apprentice in a continuous chain. But sometime in the 18th century, the knowledge was lost. Various theories exist. The ore sources were depleted, trade routes were disrupted, the last masters died without apprentices. Whatever the reason, nobody knows how to make authentic Damascus steel anymore. Modern bladesmiths have created pattern-welded steel that looks similar, but metallurgical analysis shows it's not the same. The internal structure is different. Whatever specific technique the original Damascus smiths used, it's gone. This pattern repeats throughout history. Specialized knowledge concentrated in a small number of people, transmitted through informal apprenticeship rather than written documentation, vulnerable to disruption. The Antikythera mechanism is one of the most mysterious artifacts ever discovered. It was found in 1901 in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera. When researchers finally figured out what it was, they were astonished. It's an ancient Greek astronomical calculator built sometime between 150 and 100 BCE. It's incredibly complex, with at least 30 bronze gears that can track the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, predict eclipses, and even model the irregular orbit of the moon. This isn't simple technology, this is sophisticated mechanical engineering. The gearwork is precise. The astronomical knowledge encoded in it is advanced. Whoever built this understood gear ratios, understood how to minimize mechanical error, understood astronomy well enough to model celestial mechanics in bronze. But we have nothing else like it from ancient Greece. No other examples of such sophisticated geared mechanisms, no descriptions in ancient texts of how to build such devices. The Antikythera mechanism stands alone, a singular example of a technology that apparently existed but left no other trace. Why don't we have more? Were they rare, expensive devices built only for wealthy patrons? Were they common but made of materials that didn't survive? Were the techniques known only to a small guild of specialists who kept the knowledge secret? We don't know, and that's the disturbing part. We have proof that ancient Greeks could build mechanical computers sophisticated enough to track multiple astronomical cycles simultaneously, but we have no idea how widespread this capability was, how long it lasted, or how it was eventually lost. When technology depends on individual expertise rather than documented knowledge, it's vulnerable. When it's concentrated in a small number of practitioners rather than widely distributed, it's vulnerable. When it's economically marginal rather than essential, it's vulnerable. And sometimes technologies are lost simply because replacement technologies come along. Nobody knows how to build a wooden sailing ship of the line anymore. Those massive warships that dominated naval warfare for centuries, with their complex rigging, their specialized construction techniques, their carefully shaped hulls. The knowledge is gone, not because it was deliberately suppressed, but because steel-hulled, steam-powered vessels made wooden sailing ships obsolete. As demand disappeared, the shipyards closed. The master shipwrights retired without training successors because there was no point. The knowledge evaporated. If we wanted to build an authentic 18th century ship of the line today, we'd have to reconstruct the techniques through trial and error, studying surviving examples, making educated guesses. The direct transmission of knowledge was broken. This happens faster than you'd think. Within a single generation, if a skill stops being economically valuable, the training pipeline shuts down. Within 2 generations, the living memory of how things were done is gone. Within 3 generations, you're reconstructing from documentation and archaeological evidence, if those exist. Now apply this to ancient technologies where documentation was minimal or non-existent, and you start to see the scale of the problem. How many techniques for working stone have been lost? The ancient Egyptians moved obelisks weighing hundreds of tons. The builders of Pumapunku created stone blocks fitted together so precisely you can't slide a razor blade between them. The Rapa Nui of Easter Island moved stone moai weighing up to 80 tons across miles of rough terrain. We have theories about how they did these things. Ramps, rollers, levers, sledges, ropes, but we don't know the specific techniques. And when researchers try to replicate the feats using ancient technologies, they often struggle. The theoretical knowledge is there, but the practical expertise, the tricks and techniques that would have been obvious to the ancient craftsman, that's lost. The same problem exists for metallurgy. Ancient peoples produced metals and alloys that we struggle to replicate. Indian Wootz steel, which was the basis for Damascus blades. Japanese Tamahagani steel used for samurai swords. Various bronze alloys from different cultures. We can analyze the chemical composition, but composition alone doesn't tell you the complete process. Temperature control, timing, specific techniques for working the metal while hot, all of that matters, and much of it was never written down. Or consider ancient dyes. The Phoenicians produced Tyrian purple, a dye so expensive it was reserved for royalty. It came from sea snails, thousands of them needed to produce even a small amount of dye. The exact process was a closely held trade secret. When demand for Tyrian purple declined in late antiquity, the knowledge was lost. We've reconstructed parts of the process, but probably not all of it. There might have been techniques that made production more efficient, that affected the final colour, that we'll never know about. And these are just the technologies we know were lost because we have evidence they existed. How many others were lost so completely that we don't even know they existed? This is the truly unsettling part. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Just because we don't have archaeological evidence of a technology doesn't mean it didn't exist, especially if the technology used perishable materials or was known to only a small number of people or existed for only a brief period. How many plants were domesticated and then abandoned? How many medicines were discovered and then forgotten? How many techniques for navigation, for construction, for agriculture, for anything were developed and then lost? We know this happened with crops. Several plant species show signs of having been domesticated in antiquity but are no longer cultivated. They were useful once, then fell out of favour, and the domesticated varieties either died out or reverted to wild form. The knowledge of how to cultivate them, what they were used for, that's gone. The same thing probably happened with countless other technologies. They existed for a while, served a purpose, then were forgotten when circumstances changed. And because they were forgotten completely, we don't even know to look for them. This creates a strange sort of gap in our historical knowledge. We know intellectually that technologies have been lost. We can point to specific examples: Greek fire, Roman concrete, Damascus steel, but we can't quantify the loss. We can't say how many technologies existed that we know nothing about. We can't measure the extent of what's missing. It's like standing in a library where you know some books have been removed from the shelves, but you don't know which ones or how many. The gaps are invisible until you happen to look for a specific book and discover it's missing. And this has profound implications for how we understand ancient societies. If technologies can be developed and then completely lost, if sophisticated knowledge can exist briefly and then vanish without trace, then our picture of ancient capabilities is necessarily incomplete. We're seeing a minimum level of achievement, not a complete picture. We know what they did that left durable evidence. We don't know what they did that left no trace. Maybe ancient societies were generally more capable than we give them credit for. Maybe they had technologies and knowledge that didn't survive in the archaeological record. Maybe the ancient world was stranger and more sophisticated than our evidence suggests. Or maybe not. Maybe what we see is what we get. Maybe most ancient technologies that would have left evidence did leave evidence, and we've found it, but we can't be certain. And that uncertainty, that gap in our knowledge, it's permanent. We can fill in some blanks through careful research and experimental archaeology. But there will always be lost technologies we can't recover, knowledge that vanish so completely that even its existence is uncertain. This is one of the permanent gaps in human history, the lost knowledge that we'll never recover because the transmission failed and the evidence disappeared. And it serves as a reminder that nothing is permanent. Not technology, not knowledge, not even civilization itself. Everything is contingent. Everything depends on continuous transmission, on systems that support preservation, on people who care enough to maintain what came before. The technologies we have today, the knowledge we think is secure, it's all vulnerable. It all depends on ongoing effort to preserve and transmit it. Stop that effort, and future generations might find themselves in the same position we're in, looking back at a lost epoch and wondering what their ancestors knew that they've forgotten. Let's talk about writing, specifically about what happens when writing stops. We think of writing as fundamental to civilization. It's how we record laws, preserve history, transmit knowledge across generations. It's so basic to how we operate that it's hard to imagine a complex society without it. But writing isn't inevitable, and once established, it's not permanent. Civilizations have developed writing and then lost it. Societies have been literate and then become illiterate. The ability to read and write can vanish within a few generations if the systems supporting it collapse. And when writing disappears, history disappears with it. The Rongo script of Easter Island is one of the most mysterious writing systems ever discovered. It appears on wooden tablets found on the island, carved with glyphs that are unlike any other writing system in the world. The glyphs include human figures, animals, plants, geometric shapes, celestial objects, arranged in lines that alternate direction, one line reading left to right, the next right to left. We can't read it. Nobody alive knows how to read Rongo. The last person who could read it died in the late 19th century, and they took the knowledge with them. Here's what makes this particularly tragic. When Europeans first arrived at Easter Island in 1722, the script was already rare. Only a few people, probably ritual specialists or priests, knew how to read and write it. By the time anyone thought to systematically study the script and record what it meant, those specialists were dead. European contact brought disease that devastated the island's population. Peruvian slave raids in 1862 captured many of the remaining islanders and took them to South America, where most died. The missionaries who arrived to convert the survivors actively discouraged traditional practices, including the use of Rongo. Within a few decades, the chain of transmission was broken. Now we have about 24 wooden tablets covered in glyphs we can't interpret. We can see that it's some form of writing or proto-writing. The glyphs are organized systematically. There are repeated sequences that might be formulas or epithets, but without a key, without someone who can tell us what the symbols mean, we're stuck. Is Rongo recording mythology, historical events, genealogies, religious chants? We don't know. An entire system of knowledge, potentially centuries old, locked away in symbols nobody can read. This is what happens when literacy is limited to a small group of specialists. If that group disappears before passing on their knowledge, the writing system can be lost entirely. And with it goes everything that was written down. Now, you might think this is a unique case, an isolated island with limited contact with the outside world. Surely major civilizations wouldn't lose literacy entirely, but they did. Multiple times. After the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, Greece lost literacy for 400 years. The Mycenaean civilization had used Linear B script to record palace inventories, tribute lists, religious offerings. We have tablets from the final years of the palaces, baked hard in the fires that destroyed them, preserving bureaucratic records of societies on the edge of collapse. And then, nothing. For 4 centuries, the Greeks had no writing system. Not because they forgot how to write, they completely lost the knowledge that writing had ever existed. When writing returned to Greece around 800 BCE, it came from the Phoenicians in the form of the alphabet. The Greeks adapted it for their own language, but it was a completely fresh start. Linear B was forgotten so thoroughly that when archaeologists found Linear B tablets in the ruins of Mycenaean palaces, nobody recognized them as writing. It wasn't until 1952 that Michael Ventris deciphered Linear B and proved it was an early form of Greek. Think about what that means. For 400 years, one of the most advanced civilizations in the Mediterranean had no way to keep written records. Everything had to be preserved orally or not at all. Laws, history, religious texts, technical knowledge, all of it transmitted through memory and speech. Some of it survived. The oral traditions maintained by generations of bards eventually became the Homeric epics, the Iliad and Odyssey. These poems preserve memories of the Bronze Age, of the Mycenaean palaces, of the Trojan War, but they're mythologized, transformed by centuries of oral transmission into legend. How much was lost? We'll never know. Technical knowledge about palace administration, about how the Mycenaean economy functioned, about their religious practices and beliefs beyond what survived in poetry, all gone because for 400 years there was no way to write it down, and Greece wasn't alone. The Meroitic script of the Kingdom of Kush is another lost writing system. The Kushites, who ruled Nubia and at times Egypt itself, developed their own script around the 3rd century BCE. We have inscriptions in Meroitic covering several centuries. The script appears on temples, stelae, funerary objects. It was clearly widely used for royal and religious purposes, and we can't read most of it. We can transliterate Meroitic, meaning we know what sounds the symbols represent. We can read the names of kings and gods. But we don't understand the grammar or most of the vocabulary. Without a bilingual text, like the Rosetta Stone that unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphs, we're limited to identifying proper names and guessing at context. Why can't we read it? Because when the Kingdom of Kush fell in the 4th century CE, the language and script fell with it. Later, peoples in the region spoke different languages. The knowledge of Meroitic was lost. And despite over a century of scholarly effort, despite computational linguistics and AI analysis, we're still largely locked out of understanding these texts. The Kushites ruled for over 1,000 years. They built pyramids, established trade networks, fought wars with Rome and Axum. They had a complex society with elaborate religious practices and sophisticated administration, and we can't read what they wrote about themselves. Their history, as they understood it, remains inaccessible. This is the tragedy of lost scripts. Even when the writing survives, if we can't read it, it might as well not exist. The information is there, physically present on stone or clay or whatever medium was used, but it's locked away, potentially forever. The Indus Valley script is perhaps the most famous undeciphered writing system. Over 4,000 inscribed objects have been found from the Harappan civilization. The script appears on seals, pottery, metal objects, covering about 500 years of use. It's clearly writing, or at least proto-writing of some kind. The symbols are organized systematically, show repeated sequences, appear in contexts suggesting they convey information. But the inscriptions are short. Most have fewer than 5 symbols. The longest is only 26 symbols. This makes pattern recognition difficult. We can't identify syntax or grammar from such brief texts. We can't be certain what language it represents. We don't even know if it should be read left to right, right to left, or in some other pattern. Scholars have been trying to decipher the Indus script for over a century. Various claims of decipherment have been made, none widely accepted. Some researchers think it's a logographic system representing a Dravidian language. Others think it's a mix of logographic and phonetic elements representing a language isolate. Still, others argue it's not true writing at all, just a system of symbolic markers. Without longer texts or a bilingual inscription, we may never know, and if we can't decipher it, we can't access whatever the Harappans recorded. Their administration, their economy, their beliefs, their history, all locked away in symbols we can't read. The pattern is clear. When writing systems are limited to a small literate class and that class disappears, the knowledge of how to read and write can be lost completely. When civilizations collapse and populations disperse, the continuity necessary to maintain literacy can be broken. When languages die out, texts in those languages become opaque. And once a script is lost, recovering it is incredibly difficult, sometimes impossible. The Linear A script of the Minoans is still undeciphered. We know Linear B, which was used by the Mycenaeans because we found enough texts and Michael Ventris realized it represented an early form of Greek. But Linear A, the earlier script used by the Minoans, remains mysterious. We can transliterate some of it because some symbols are similar to Linear B, but we don't know what language it represents. Probably not Greek. Maybe an unknown language that went extinct with Minoan civilization. Maybe something else. Without knowing the language, we can't fully decipher the script. And without more texts, ideally longer texts than the fragmentary tablets we have, we might never figure it out. These lost scripts represent gaps in historical knowledge that are particularly frustrating because the information still exists. It's physically present. We can see the writing, we can photograph it, study it, analyze it, but we can't read it. The meaning is locked away, and we don't have the key. And it's not just ancient scripts. Writing systems have been lost in relatively recent history too. The Jurchen script, used in medieval China by the Jurchen people who established the Jin dynasty, is only partly understood. The script was used from the 12th to 15th centuries, then fell out of use as the Jurchen were absorbed into Chinese culture. By the time scholars got around to studying it systematically, nobody could read it fluently. We've made progress through comparison with Chinese texts and with the related Manchu script, but large portions of Jurchen texts remain untranslatable. The Tangut script, used by the Western Xia dynasty from the 11th to 13th centuries, was similarly lost when the Mongols conquered the Western Xia and destroyed their kingdom. The script was incredibly complex, with over 6,000 characters. It was a creation of the Tangut themselves, not borrowed from Chinese. When their kingdom fell, knowledge of the script declined rapidly. By the time of the Ming dynasty a century later, nobody could read it anymore. Modern scholars have made significant progress in deciphering Tangut, but it took decades of work and comparison with Chinese, Tibetan, and other languages, and there are still gaps in our understanding, words and phrases we're uncertain about. What's disturbing is how quickly literacy can be lost. The Western Xia fell in 1227. By 1300, probably nobody could read Tangut fluently anymore. That's less than a century, 3 generations. Within the lifetime of a single person born during the fall of Western Xia, the script went from common use to complete obscurity. This is how fast cultural knowledge can evaporate. If it's not actively maintained, if there's no institutional support, if the younger generation doesn't learn it, within decades it can be gone. And once it's gone, recovery might be impossible. Now think about what this means for our understanding of history. Every undeciphered script represents a gap in our knowledge, potentially a huge gap. The Harappans left thousands of inscriptions. If we could read them, we might understand their civilization completely differently. The Minoans recorded something in Linear A. If we knew what it said, Minoan history might be transformed. The Kushites wrote about their kings and their gods and their wars. If we could read Meroitic fluently, we'd have an entirely different perspective on Northeast African history. These gaps are permanent unless we get lucky, unless we find a bilingual text, unless we make a breakthrough in decipherment, unless something unexpected turns up that gives us the key. Most likely, these scripts will remain partly or wholly unreadable forever. And that means the people who use them will remain partly or wholly silent. We can study their artifacts, their buildings, their bones, but we can't hear their voices. We can't know how they described themselves, what they thought was important, what stories they told, what they believed. The written record, when it exists, is our most direct access to ancient minds. But when writing is lost, that access is cut off. We're left looking at material culture and trying to infer meaning, which works to a degree, but it's not the same as reading what they wrote. And even when we can read ancient scripts, even when literacy continued and we have texts, there are still gaps. Because writing isn't neutral. What gets written down reflects choices about what's considered important enough to record. Most ancient writing is administrative. Tax records, property transfers, tribute lists, inventories. This tells us about economics and governance, but not much about daily life. Religious texts are common: prayers, rituals, myths. This tells us about belief systems, but is often formulaic and focused on the elite. Royal inscriptions proclaim victories and building projects. This tells us about political history, but from a propaganda perspective. What's missing? The voices of ordinary people, their daily concerns, their personal thoughts, their perspectives on events. Most ancient people were illiterate. The literate minority were mostly elites or scribes working for elites. What they wrote reflected elite concerns. We get occasional glimpses of ordinary lives, letters preserved in trash heaps, graffiti scratched on walls. But these are rare. For most of history, the vast majority of people are silent in the written record, not because they had nothing to say, but because nobody thought their words were worth writing down. This creates another kind of gap, not a complete absence of writing, but a systematic bias in what was written. We see history from the top down, from the perspective of kings and priests and administrators. The other perspectives, the ones that might give us a more complete picture, those are mostly missing. And as we go further back in time, the written record gets thinner. Fewer texts survive. The ones that do survive are increasingly fragmentary and difficult to interpret. Eventually, we hit periods where writing doesn't exist yet or has been lost, and we're back to archaeology and inference. The pre-literate periods aren't dark because nothing was happening. They're dark because we can't see what was happening. The people living then had rich cultural lives, complex social systems, accumulated knowledge. But without writing, most of that is inaccessible to us. Oral traditions preserve some information. We know this because some cultures maintained sophisticated oral histories that were eventually written down. The Maori of New Zealand, for example, preserved genealogies and migration accounts going back centuries through oral tradition. When these were finally recorded in the 19th and 20th centuries, they provided remarkable historical information that archaeological evidence has generally confirmed. But oral traditions are vulnerable. They require continuous transmission. Break the chain and the knowledge is lost. And oral traditions can change over time, adapting to new circumstances, incorporating new elements. sometimes diverging significantly from original events, so we have to treat oral traditions carefully. They contain real historical information, but it's often mixed with legend, mythology, and later additions. Sorting out what's historically accurate from what's cultural construction is challenging, and for most pre-literate societies, we don't have even that. The oral traditions were lost before anyone recorded them. The knowledge died with the last generation that remembered. This is the fundamental problem with the written record. It's incomplete, biased toward elites, vulnerable to loss, and absent entirely for most of human history. The gaps in writing are gaps in our access to the past, and some of those gaps will never be filled. We're getting better at extracting information from non-textual sources. Archaeology provides context. DNA analysis reveals population movements and relationships. Linguistic analysis traces the evolution and relationships of languages. Climate reconstructions tell us about environmental conditions. All of this helps fill in the picture, but it's still incomplete. It will always be incomplete. The written word, when it exists and when we can read it, gives us something unique, direct access to how people describe themselves and their world. When writing is lost, that access disappears, and we're left in the dark, trying to reconstruct what people were thinking and doing without being able to ask them. That's the gap. That's what we've lost. Not just information, but voices. Not just data, but perspective. The ability to hear the past, speak in its own words, rather than having to interpret its mute remains. And it's a reminder that writing, like every other technology, like civilization itself, is fragile. It requires continuous maintenance. Stop teaching people to read and write, and within a generation or two, literacy can vanish. Let the institutions that support documentation collapse and the records stop being kept. Destroy the texts that exist and the knowledge in them is gone. The gaps in the written record aren't just unfortunate accidents, they're warnings about how easily knowledge can be lost, how quickly voices can be silenced, how rapidly darkness can descend. Now let's talk about something that sounds like science fiction but is absolutely real. The lost world beneath the waves. At the height of the last ice age, about 20,000 years ago, sea levels were roughly 400 feet lower than they are today. That's not a small difference. That's the height of a 40-story building. It's enough to completely transform coastlines, to expose vast areas of continental shelf, to turn what are now underwater plateaus into dry land. Millions of square miles that are now underwater were habitable terrain, and humans would have lived there because coastlines are prime real estate, rich in resources, fish and shellfish, birds, seals, easy to navigate along, often more moderate in climate than inland areas. If you're a hunter-gatherer looking for a good place to settle, coastlines are attractive. And then the Ice Age ended. Slowly over thousands of years, the glaciers melted. The water, locked up in those massive ice sheets, flowed back into the oceans. Sea levels rose, not uniformly, not predictably, but steadily, inexorably. The coastal settlements that humans had built, the places where they'd lived for generations or centuries, these were inundated. As the water rose, people would have moved inland, migrated to higher ground, abandoned their coastal homes to the sea, and everything they left behind was drowned. Structures, artifacts, trash heaps, burial sites, all now underwater, often buried under sediment, scattered by currents, invisible to normal archaeology. We've lost an entire world, a complete epoch of human history beneath the rising seas. Think about what this means. For most of human prehistory, the coastlines were in completely different places than they are now. We talk about coastal adaptation, about maritime cultures, about the importance of the sea in human development, but we're looking at the wrong coastlines, the coastlines where humans actually lived for tens of thousands of years. Those are underwater now. Every now and then we get a glimpse of what's down there. Off the coast of India, divers have found submerged structures in the Gulf of Cambay, stone structures, walls, what might be foundations of buildings, lying 120 feet underwater. Carbon dating of artifacts from the site suggests ages of 9,000 to 10,000 years, which would put them underwater since the end of the last ice age. The structures are controversial. Some researchers think they're natural rock formations that look artificial. Others think they're genuinely artificial, but their age is uncertain. Without systematic underwater excavation, which is expensive and difficult, we can't be sure. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Monument sits underwater near Yonaguni Island. It's a massive rock formation with right angles, flat surfaces, apparent steps, and terraces. It looks artificial. It looks like something humans carved. But most geologists think it's natural, a product of erosion along existing joint patterns in the rock. They point out that the local sandstone naturally fractures in ways that can create right angles and flat surfaces. They argue that while it looks artificial, natural processes can explain all its features. A minority think it's partly or wholly artificial. They point to features that look like cut marks, to shapes that seem too regular to be natural. They suggest it might be a natural formation that was modified by humans, or possibly an entirely artificial structure. The debate continues because underwater archaeology is hard, really hard. You need specialized equipment, trained divers, careful methodology to avoid disturbing sediments, and even then, dating underwater rock formations is extremely difficult. You can't use radiocarbon dating on stone. You have to find associated organic material, if any exists, and hasn't been scattered by currents. So the question remains open. Yonaguni might be natural, it might be artificial, it might be something in between. And if it is artificial, we have no idea who made it, or when, or why. These are just the sites we've found by accident. How many more are out there, undiscovered? The ancient coastlines are mostly unexplored. We have maps of the ocean floor, but the resolution isn't good enough to identify structures the size of buildings or villages. You need targeted surveys with high-resolution sonar, which requires knowing where to look, and most of the ancient coastline is buried under sediment anyway. When sea levels rose, the flooding didn't just cover the land with water, currents and rivers deposited sediments on top. In many areas, the old land surfaces are buried under feet or tens of feet of mud and sand. They're not just underwater, they're underground underwater. Finding sites under those conditions is incredibly difficult. You can't see them from the surface, you can't spot them with simple sonar. You need sub-bottom profiling equipment that can see through sediment, and even then, you need some idea of where to look. So the vast majority of ancient coastal settlements remain undiscovered. They're out there somewhere, buried under water and mud, slowly being destroyed by currents and marine organisms, lost to history, and this represents an enormous gap in our knowledge. For modern humans, the period from roughly 100,000 to 10,000 years ago is crucial. This is when we spread out of Africa, when we developed sophisticated tool technologies, when we started creating art and jewelry and complex social structures. This is when we became behaviorally modern humans. But for most of this period, humans lived on coastlines that are now underwater. The sites we've found, the ones that inform our understanding of human development, these are mostly inland sites, caves, rock shelters. These are important, but they're not representative of where most people were living. Coastal peoples would have had different adaptations, different technologies, different ways of life. They would have developed watercraft earlier, fishing techniques earlier, sophisticated understanding of marine resources and tides and seasonal patterns. All of this would have driven cognitive and cultural development in ways we can barely glimpse from the inland sites. And we've lost most of the evidence. The sites are underwater, the artifacts are scattered, the organic materials have mostly decomposed. We're missing massive portions of the human story. Consider the peopling of the Americas. The current evidence suggests humans arrived in the Americas sometime before 15,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. They most likely came by boat, following the Pacific coastline down from Alaska. But that coastline is now underwater. The beaches where the first Americans made landfall, the camps where they stopped, the routes they followed as they explored south, all underwater. We're trying to understand how humans populated two continents with most of the evidence submerged. We find occasional sites inland, places where early Americans left tools and bones and fire pits. These sites are pushed earlier and earlier as new discoveries are made, but the coastal migration route, which was probably the main pathway, that's mostly inaccessible. The same problem exists for the peopling of Australia. Humans reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. This required ocean voyages, not just crossing narrow straits, but sailing across open water, reaching islands that weren't visible from land. This is sophisticated maritime activity. Building seaworthy watercraft, navigating across open ocean, establishing populations on new land masses. This suggests a level of cognitive and technological capability that's impressive for the time period. But where's the evidence? Where are the boats, the harbours, the coastal settlements? Mostly underwater. The coastline of the Sahul landmass, which included Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania during the Ice Age, is now drowned. The places where the first Australians lived as they expanded across the continent, these are underwater. We're trying to understand a maritime migration with almost no access to the maritime sites. Or consider the Mediterranean. During the Ice Age, the Mediterranean coastline looked completely different. Islands that are now separate were connected. Areas that are now shallow seas were dry land. The Adriatic Sea was much smaller. The Aegean had more land bridges. Humans would have lived on these exposed areas. They would have crossed from one island to another on land bridges that no longer exist. And when sea levels rose, those populations would have been fragmented, isolated, forced to adapt to insular environments. How did this affect cultural development? How did the flooding of the land bridges shape the populations of Mediterranean islands? We can't fully answer these questions because the land bridges themselves are underwater, and any evidence of human presence on them is inaccessible. There are tantalizing hints, though, that the lost coastlines hold secrets. Underwater caves in the Mediterranean have yielded evidence of human occupation. Cosca Cave in France has its entrance 120 feet underwater now, but during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, the entrance was on dry land. Inside the cave, which extends above current water level, there are paintings and engravings of animals, handprints, and geometric designs. These date to around 27,000 and 19,000 years ago, when the cave was accessible from the then exposed coastline. If Cosca Cave survived with its art intact, what else might be out there in underwater caves and rock shelters? How many painted caves, how many living sites are now submerged and undiscovered? The Black Sea has an unusual history. During the last Ice Age, it wasn't connected to the Mediterranean. It was a large freshwater lake, fed by rivers, at a much lower elevation than today. Around 7,500 years ago, as sea levels rose, the Mediterranean breached the Bosporus and flooded into the Black Sea basin. The flooding was catastrophic. Millions of cubic feet of water per day poured through the strait. The Black Sea level rose rapidly, hundreds of feet in a relatively short period. Coastal settlements around the Black Sea would have been inundated, their inhabitants forced to flee inland. Some researchers think this flooding might be the basis for ancient flood myths, including possibly the biblical flood story. Whether or not that's true, the flooding definitely happened, and it definitely drowned any human settlements on the Black Sea coast. Underwater archaeology in the Black Sea has found ancient coastlines, preserved remarkably well in the anoxic deep water that prevents decay. They've found stone tools, wooden structures, even ancient shipwrecks in excellent condition. But systematic exploration has been limited. Most of the ancient coastline remains unexplored. What might be down there? Neolithic villages, early agricultural settlements, fishing communities, all frozen in time under the water, waiting to be discovered. And the Black Sea is just one example. Every coastline where sea levels have risen has similar potential, submerged sites waiting to be found. But finding them requires resources. Underwater archaeology is expensive. It requires ships, specialized equipment, trained personnel. It's slower than terrestrial archaeology because everything is more difficult underwater. You can't just dig a test pit. You need divers or submersibles. You need to deal with currents, limited visibility, the constant risk that sediments will shift and bury your work. As a result, underwater archaeology has focused mostly on shipwrecks and submerged structures that are already known. The systematic survey of ancient coastlines, looking for settlements and evidence of early human activity, this has barely begun. We're only scratching the surface, literally, of what's hidden beneath the waves. And as we develop better technology, side-scan sonar, remotely operated vehicles, autonomous underwater drones, we'll find more. We'll gradually fill in some of the gaps, recovering pieces of the lost coastal world. But some of it is probably gone forever, destroyed by currents, buried too deeply to recover, scattered beyond recognition. The sea is not a gentle preserver. It's powerful, constantly in motion, grinding away at anything exposed to it. The lost coastlines represent one of the largest gaps in our understanding of human prehistory. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived on lands that are now underwater. They developed technologies, created cultures, built settlements, all now lost beneath the waves. We can see the evidence of human occupation inland, in the caves and rock shelters that survived. But the coastal story, which might have been where the most interesting developments happened, that's mostly gone. It's a gap we're just beginning to explore. And every discovery raises more questions. Every submerged site that's found makes us wonder what else is out there, how much we're missing, how different our picture of human history might be if we could recover the lost coastal world. The seas hold secrets. Entire chapters of human history are hidden in the depths, waiting for someone to find them, to bring them back to light, to let them speak after thousands of years of silence. But for now, they remain in the gap, the lost epoch beneath the waves, silent and invisible, reminding us that what we know about the past is only a fraction of what actually happened. Let's talk about one of the most controversial topics in archaeology, the possibility that there's more missing from our understanding of the past than we're willing to admit, that the gaps aren't just empty spaces where evidence hasn't survived, that maybe, just maybe, there were achievements, knowledge systems, possibly even civilizations that we've missed entirely. This is uncomfortable territory because suggesting that mainstream archaeology might be missing major pieces of the picture sounds like pseudo-archaeology, sounds like the kind of thing that leads to claims about ancient aliens or Atlantis or other nonsense. But here's the thing, we know for certain that archaeology has been wrong before. Major discoveries have completely overturned accepted timelines. Sites have been found that weren't supposed to exist. Capabilities have been proven that were thought impossible for the time period. So it's worth asking, what else might we be missing? Take Göbekli Tepe. When it was first discovered in the 1990s, it broke the established model of how civilization develops. Here was a massive stone temple complex built 11,600 years ago by hunter-gatherers who hadn't invented agriculture yet, who had no permanent settlements, who supposedly couldn't organize large-scale construction projects. It shouldn't exist. According to the old model, you need agriculture first, then surplus food, then sedentary communities, then specialized labor, then monumental architecture. But Göbekli Tepe reverses the sequence. The monumentality came first, possibly even driving the development of agriculture to support the people building it. This discovery forced archaeologists to rethink fundamental assumptions about how civilization develops. If hunter-gatherers could build Göbekli Tepe, what else might they have been capable of? What other assumptions might be wrong? And Göbekli Tepe wasn't an isolated case. In the same region of southeastern Turkey, several other similar sites have been found. Nivali Chori, Karahan Tepe, others, they're all from roughly the same period, all showing similar monumental construction by pre-agricultural societies. This was a phenomenon, not a unique occurrence. Something was happening in this region at the end of the Ice Age, something that allowed hunter-gatherer groups to come together, coordinate large construction projects, create complex symbolic systems. But here's the question. Was it really limited to this region, or were similar developments happening elsewhere in places where the evidence hasn't survived or hasn't been found yet? The climate at the end of the Ice Age was volatile. The Younger Dryas, that 1,300-year period of sudden cooling, disrupted societies worldwide. When it ended around 11,600 years ago, the climate stabilized rapidly. Within a few centuries, temperatures reached modern levels, the glaciers retreated, sea levels began rising steadily. This was a period of enormous change. Human societies were adapting to new environments, exploiting new resources, developing new technologies. It's entirely plausible that sophisticated developments were happening in multiple places simultaneously. but most of the evidence from this period is gone or hidden. The sea level rise drowned the coastlines. Thousands of years of subsequent occupation and agriculture have disturbed or buried inland sites. We're looking at a fragmentary record from a crucial period of human development. What if Göbekli Tepe isn't unusual? What if it's just the only major site from this period that happened to survive in good enough condition for us to recognize what it was? Consider this. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried around 10,000 years ago. The people who built it carefully filled in the entire complex with dirt, preserving it. If they hadn't done that, if they just abandoned it, 11,600 years of weathering and erosion would have reduced it to ambiguous rubble. We might not even recognize it as an artificial structure. How many other sites from this period have been destroyed by time? How many others are buried so deeply we haven't found them? How many are underwater, scattered by currents, lost forever? The more we look at this period, the stranger it gets. Take the Karahan Tepe site, discovered recently near Göbekli Tepe. It's potentially even larger than Göbekli Tepe and shows similarly sophisticated construction and carving. The excavations are still in early stages, but what they're finding is remarkable. Underground chambers carved with intricate reliefs, massive stone pillars, evidence of large-scale organized activity. And this site, like Göbekli Tepe, dates to the end of the Ice Age, to a period when humans were supposedly living in small bands, following herds, not capable of major construction projects. But clearly they were capable. We have the proof. The question is, how much more proof is out there waiting to be found? The mainstream archaeological position is cautious. Yes, Göbekli Tepe and related sites show that pre-agricultural societies were more sophisticated than previously thought. Yes, this requires revising some assumptions, but these sites are still unusual, still outliers. The general model of civilization development still holds. Maybe. But maybe we're being too cautious. Maybe there's a whole category of sites we've missed because we weren't looking for them, because we assumed they couldn't exist. Consider underwater sites again. We've barely explored the ancient coastlines. What if there are dozens or hundreds of sites like Göbekli Tepe that are now submerged? What if the most sophisticated developments of the late Ice Age happened on coastlines that are now 300 feet underwater? We'd miss them entirely. We wouldn't even know to look for them because we've been focused on the inland sites that survived. Or consider tropical regions. Archaeology in tropical areas is notoriously difficult. The heat and humidity destroy organic materials rapidly. The vegetation covers sites quickly. The soil chemistry is often hostile to preservation, and many tropical regions haven't been surveyed systematically because they're remote, difficult to access, politically unstable, or all of the above. What's hidden in the Amazon, in Central Africa, in Southeast Asia? LiDAR surveys have started revealing massive complexes of earthworks and settlements in the Amazon that nobody knew existed. Cities, agricultural systems, populations far larger than previously thought. If the Amazon had sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations that we're only now discovering, what else might be out there in other tropical regions that we haven't surveyed? Every few years, a new discovery makes the news. Ancient city found in jungle, mysterious structures revealed by satellite imagery, unknown civilization identified through DNA analysis. Each discovery adds to our knowledge, but it also highlights how much we don't know. The the gaps are always bigger than we think. Now, here's where we need to be careful, because acknowledging gaps in our knowledge is different from filling those gaps with speculation. Just because we might be missing evidence doesn't mean we should assume specific claims without proof. Some people take the gaps and fill them with lost civilizations, advanced ancient technologies, knowledge systems that rivaled or surpassed our own. The problem is, there's no good evidence for these claims. They're speculation dressed up as fact. But dismissing all speculation is also a mistake. Science advances by asking questions, by challenging assumptions, by investigating possibilities even when they seem unlikely. So let's consider some possibilities seriously, without assuming they're true, but without dismissing them out of hand either. Possibility 1. There were sophisticated Ice Age cultures whose evidence didn't survive. Not civilizations in the sense of cities and writing, but complex hunter-gatherer societies with advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, navigation, medicine, other skills that didn't require written records or permanent settlements. These societies could have been widespread, could have existed for thousands of years, and then disappeared when the Ice Age ended, leaving little trace because their knowledge was oral and their structures were built from perishable materials. Is this possible? Yes. We know complex hunter-gatherer societies existed. The evidence from Göbekli Tepe proves it, so it's not speculative to suggest there might have been others. Is there evidence? Not much direct evidence, but that's the point. If these societies existed and left minimal archaeological trace, we'd see exactly what we do see. A few exceptional sites like Göbekli Tepe, and otherwise a frustratingly thin record from this crucial period. Possibility 2, there was more long-distance contact and knowledge exchange in the ancient world than we realize. Not because of lost civilizations, but because ancient peoples were more mobile and connected than we give them credit for. Maybe information traveled further and faster than we think. Maybe innovations developed in one region spread widely through trade and migration. Maybe the ancient world was smaller and more interconnected than our evidence suggests. Is this possible? Yes, we keep finding evidence of ancient trade networks that were far more extensive than previously thought. The genetic evidence shows more population movement than we expected, so it's plausible that knowledge and ideas travelled further than we can easily track. Is there evidence? Some. The spread of agricultural techniques, of metallurgy, of various technologies suggests diffusion of knowledge. But the mechanisms aren't always clear. How much was independent invention versus transmission? We don't always know. Possibility 3, there are major archaeological sites still undiscovered, either because they're buried, underwater, or in regions that haven't been adequately surveyed. These sites, when found, might significantly change our understanding of what ancient peoples were capable of and when various developments occurred. Is this possible? Absolutely. Major sites are discovered regularly. Göbekli Tepe wasn't found until 1994. Karahan Tepe is being excavated now. LiDAR is revealing huge complexes in the Amazon that weren't known before. There's every reason to think more major sites are out there waiting. Is there evidence? Yes, in the sense that we keep finding sites that surprise us. Each discovery suggests there are more. How many more? We won't know until we find them. These possibilities are different from claiming that Atlantis existed or that ancient aliens built the pyramids. They're extrapolations from evidence we have, attempts to fill the gaps with scenarios that are plausible given what we know. But they're still speculative. They might be wrong. The mainstream archaeological view might be essentially correct. The developments we see in the archaeological record represent most of what happened, with only minor additions to be made as new sites are discovered. The honest answer is, we don't know. The gaps exist. We can measure them to some extent, can identify periods and regions where our evidence is thin, but we can't know what's in those gaps until we find it. And that's okay. That's how science works. You identify what you know, acknowledge what you don't know, and keep investigating. You follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it contradicts previous assumptions. You remain open to new discoveries while being skeptical of claims that aren't supported by evidence. The lost epochs, the missing chapters of human history, they're real. We can identify them. We can see where the evidence runs out, where the timelines get fuzzy, where we're making educated guesses rather than working from solid data. What we can't do is fill those gaps with certainty. Not yet, maybe not ever for some of them, but we can keep looking. We can survey the ancient coastlines with better technology. We can use LiDAR to penetrate jungle canopy and find lost cities. We can analyze ancient DNA to track population movements. We can excavate sites that previous generations of archaeologists didn't think were important. We can apply new techniques to old evidence and see things that weren't visible before. Each discovery illuminates another corner of the past. Each new technique opens possibilities for finding evidence that was previously inaccessible. Each generation of researchers brings fresh perspectives and asks new questions. The gaps are real, but they're not necessarily permanent. Some of them can be filled, some mysteries can be solved. Some lost epochs can be recovered, at least partially. And even the gaps that remain, the mysteries we can't solve, they serve a purpose. They remind us of the limits of our knowledge. They keep us humble. They show us that history is stranger and more complex than any simple narrative can capture. The lost epochs are out there, in the darkness between what we know. Some will eventually come to light. Others will remain hidden forever. But all of them, discovered or undiscovered, are part of the human story. Part of the vast, complex, still unfolding tale of what it means to be human. So here we are at the end of our journey through the gaps. And the honest truth is, we've solved nothing. We've raised more questions than we've answered. We've identified absences without being able to fill them. We've pointed at the darkness without being able to illuminate it fully. But that's the point, isn't it? The lost epochs aren't problems to be solved in a single video or a single lifetime. They're ongoing mysteries, puzzles that have existed for thousands of years and will continue to exist for thousands more. They're reminders that we don't have all the answers, that we'll never have all the answers, that the story of humanity is far too complex and sprawling for any one generation to fully understand. And there's something deeply comforting about that. In a world that often feels completely mapped, totally understood, with no mysteries left, the lost epochs remind us that wonder still exists, that there are still things to discover, still questions to ask, still frontiers to explore, even if those frontiers are in the past rather than the future. Every gap in our historical knowledge represents an opportunity, a chance for future researchers to make their mark, a puzzle waiting for someone clever enough or lucky enough to solve, a door that might open if you just figure out where the handle is. Maybe you're listening to this and thinking, this is interesting, but it doesn't really affect me. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not going to discover a lost civilization. These mysteries are for experts to solve. But that's not quite true, because the gaps in our knowledge aren't just academic problems. They're reminders about the nature of knowledge itself, about how fragile it is, how easily it can be lost, how much effort it takes to preserve it. Every lost epoch happened because knowledge wasn't preserved, because systems collapsed, because people didn't write things down, or the things they wrote didn't survive, because the chain of transmission was broken, because nobody thought the information was important enough to save, and that's still happening right now. Languages are going extinct at an alarming rate, and with them go entire ways of understanding the world. Traditional knowledge systems are being lost as elders die without passing on their wisdom. Cultural practices are disappearing as younger generations move to cities and adopt modern lifestyles. In 100 years, future historians will look back at our time and identify gaps, things we knew that they've forgotten, perspectives we had that they can't access, knowledge that we failed to preserve. The lost epochs aren't just in the past, they're being created right now. So maybe the lesson here is that preservation matters, that recording knowledge matters, that passing on what we know to the next generation matters. Because if we don't, if we assume it'll always be available, if we think someone else will take care of it, we risk creating the next gap. But there's also a lesson about humility. We don't know as much as we think we do. Our picture of the past is incomplete, biased, full of holes. We're making educated guesses about huge portions of human history. And some of those guesses are probably wrong. Being comfortable with uncertainty, being willing to say, I don't know, being open to the possibility that our understanding might change dramatically with the next major discovery. These are important skills, not just for historians and archaeologists, but for everyone, because life is full of gaps, full of things we don't understand, questions we can't answer, mysteries we can't solve. And being okay with that, being curious about it rather than frustrated by it, makes life richer. The lost epochs teach us to be comfortable with mystery, to accept that some questions don't have answers, at least not yet, to find beauty in the unknown rather than being threatened by it. And who knows? Maybe one of you listening to this right now will be the one who fills in one of the gaps. Maybe you'll be the researcher who deciphers an ancient script, who discovers a lost city, who figures out what happened to a vanished civilization. Maybe you'll be the one who brings light to a corner of the past that's been dark for thousands of years. Or maybe not. Maybe you'll just be someone who finds these mysteries fascinating, who enjoys pondering the questions even without expecting answers, who appreciates the vastness of what we don't know as much as the smallness of what we do. Either way, the lost epochs are here for you. They're not going anywhere. They've been waiting for thousands of years, and they'll wait a while longer. The gaps in history aren't obstacles to overcome. They're invitations. They're the universe's way of saying, there's still more to discover, still more to learn, still more to wonder about. So if you've made it this far, if these mysteries have captured your imagination at all, leave a comment. Let me know where you're watching from. Are you in a place where lost civilizations once thrived? on land that was underwater 10,000 years ago, in a city built on the ruins of earlier settlements. We're all part of this ongoing story, this endless quest to understand where we came from and how we got here. And every voice matters, every perspective adds something, every person wondering about the past contributes to the collective effort to make sense of it. Hit the like button if these mysteries resonated with you. Subscribe if you want to explore more of history's dark corners together, because there are always more gaps to investigate, more lost epochs to illuminate, more mysteries waiting in the shadows. And if you're drifting off to sleep right now, let these questions follow you into your dreams. Imagine those lost coastlines, now underwater. Picture the civilizations that appeared suddenly, fully formed. Wonder about the knowledge systems that vanished without trace. Think about all the people who lived and loved and built and created things that we'll never see, never know about, never fully understand. They were here, they mattered, they left marks on the world, even if those marks have faded almost to invisibility. The past is still out there, waiting, and so is the future of discovery. New technologies, new techniques, new perspectives, all bringing light to places that have been dark for millennia. The lost epochs aren't lost forever, they're just lost for now. And somewhere out there, in a future we can't quite see yet, someone will find what we've been missing. Someone will solve the mysteries we couldn't crack. Someone will bring voices out of the silence. Until then, we have the questions, we have the mysteries, we have the gaps themselves, strange absences that shape our understanding of the past as much as the evidence we have. And we have the comfort of knowing that history is far stranger, far more complex, far more wondrous than we usually give it credit for. Sleep well, dream of lost cities and forgotten knowledge. And when you wake, remember that every day is another chance to discover something that's been waiting in the darkness, hoping someone will finally remember it was there. The lost epochs are calling. Are you listening?